Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I would like to show you um, what I believe is now the cornerstone of my work here at the Mesa of Life. Um, I've synthesized together the doctrine of the wolf, the deep rejection bell, um, golden snitch detection, um, the whole litany of tools and psychological processes that I have crafted here, standing on the shoulders of giants. And today I would like to go through that with you guys. I'm not able to, I can probably share this essay um, on in parts on here, but I guess I'm just too excited to share it, and I'd like to just kind of go over it with everybody. Um, and see what everybody thinks about it. So I've come up with this thing called the chorus Commonwealth because I keep seeing this bottleneck in humanity. And the bottleneck is this, somebody does something great. Nobody else comes to help them, and they get their throats slit. The future comes through this singular person. They have this vision. There's this Messiah figure, and nobody else believes they can do what this person does. And so the future is constrained to one throat singing a song. And then when that one throat is slit, the future collapses and it never comes to be. We worship these martyrs. We feel guilty about it, but we don't really do anything about it. We don't really embody the lessons because we think that we can't fill those shoes. Okay, so how on earth do we build a future with too many roots to be murdered, too many throats to be slit? How do you do that? So there's this little scene in Matthew in the Bible that's been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years, like this live wire underneath the floorboards of civilization itself. And I don't think we've understood how dangerous it is. Everybody knows the surface of this story. The storm is on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples are in the boat, getting knocked about by wind and water. And they probably smell like wet wool and panic. And then Jesus comes, walking towards them on the sea. And then Peter, being Peter, does the one thing in the room that's either magnificent or insane, which is often the only doorway God seems to have unlocked. He asks to come out there too. Jesus says, "Come." Peter steps out. And for a moment, the impossible is no longer a miracle performed by the divine over there. It's being embodied by Peter. It is a path under a human foot. And then Peter notices the wind. Fear floods his body. And then he goes down. Jesus catches him. They get back into the boat, and the disciples begin to worship Jesus. That's the text. And that's the whole wound of human civilization. Peter did not merely witness the impossible, he participated in it. He actually walked on water. The tragedy is not that he sank. Of course he sank. Any honest man knows what happens when the animal body remembers that water can fill your lungs. The deeper scandal here is that the boat does not become a school afterward. Nobody seems to say, wait a damn minute. Peter made 3 steps. What if the point was not simply that Jesus is special, but that the divine was recruiting apprentices to do it too? That we could all be Super Saiyans and walk on water. That you can learn this power too. That, Jesus is a teacher showing everybody how special they are and how powerful that they are. Instead, the miracle collapses back into reverence, back into people getting on their knees, believing that they can't do this. And reverence, when it's not careful, becomes the velvet rope keeping responsibility on the other side of the Messiah. And that right there is the human bottleneck I'm talking about. We keep seeing the best of ourselves appear in one body in the other. And instead of learning the method ourselves, we build a shrine. We get on our knees. We start worshiping it. We call that humility. But sometimes it is cowardice with candles. Cowardice with candles all around it. We say, I can never, ever be like that. And half the time, what we really mean is, please don't make me responsible for what I have now seen. See, the boat is not evil because it floats. Sometimes you need a boat. You need a reprieve. Sometimes the boat is the only sane place to catch your breath with your friends, to bind your wounds, to pass around the bread and stop everybody from drowning. The boat becomes evil when it hardens into a spectator box, into like those 2 old men up in the Muppets balcony. Just, going on and on, bitching and moaning. When the boat becomes its spectator box, it turns grown souls into audience members of holiness. It trains people to admire courage instead of practicing it themselves. And this is why the chorus Commonwealth matters. It's not like this cute little name for a club I've made up. It's not like a branding flourish. It's an answer to one of the oldest, ugliest patterns in all of human history. Humanity produces visionaries, right? Leaves them carrying too much of the future alone, watches them get betrayed or murdered, and then embalms the failure as inspiration. Prophet, reformer, liberator, whistleblower, teacher, founder, artist, saint, organizer, revolutionary. The body changes, the mechanism repeats over and over and over again. A person sees straight through the fog, names the rot of civilization, carries the burden, carries the cross, gathers the first sparks, and the crowd does what crowds do under pressure. It admires the survivable distance. It doesn't get involved. It doesn't get close. It just admires from a survivable distance. It waits to see if the miracle is safe. It lets one throat hold the song, and then when the knife comes to slit it, the crowd discovers theology, nostalgia, and commemorative murals to honor the martyr. And I'm not saying this with contempt for, ordinary people. That's too easy. And frankly, it's fucking lazy. Most people are not cartoon cowards sitting in the boat, twirling a little mustache made of wet rope. They're tired. They're underpaid. They're raising children without help. They're carrying family wounds, medical bills, social terror, spiritual confusion, and the ancient mammalian knowledge built in our DNA that stepping out into the light alone can get you killed. The vampires understand this perfectly. They never ask people to become whole. They offer people a bargain. They give them status, certainty, a tribe, protection and permission, and an enemy to hate. Meanwhile, the good too often wanders into the square with a crown of thorns and says, "Who wants responsibility?" And then they act stunned when the sign-up sheet is thin. So the answer cannot be simply yelling at Peter for sinking. That is not formation. That's not going to bring a better future. That's just another man on the shore with dry sandals giving commentary from the Muppets spectator box. The answer is to change what happens after Peter is pulled out of the water. The answer is to turn the boat into a training vessel before some later tyrant comes along, burns it, and calls the screams salvation. This is where the Mesa of life has found its cornerstone. The Messiah must become a method. But that line only means something if it's not treated like a fucking slogan. It means that any living example of courage or wisdom, sovereignty, or divine participation has to be translated into practices other people can actually learn. Not everyone is called to be a Thomas Sankara, a Jesus Christ, a Ella Baker, or some other thunder-eyed mythic founder with a jawline carved by destiny and sleep deprivation. Fine. Good. Thank God even. If everyone tried to be the Messiah by Friday, civilization would not be saved. It would become a LinkedIn retreat with incense and delusions of grandeur. The point is not to inflate every ego into a little god. The point is to stop using exceptional people as evidence that everyone else is exempt. Rene Girard helps us understand why the old machine is so hard to break. In Girard's account, communities under mimetic pressure, rivalry, intimation, envy, contagion, violence, often resolve their crises by discharging it into a scapegoat. The victim's death or expulsion brings a strange peace to everybody. And because the peace feels miraculous, the victim becomes sacred in collective memory. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy surmises that Girard's view bluntly states the scapegoat mechanism brings unexpected peace. The victim is consecrated. The religion grows around that social integration, and Britannica puts the same wound in another way. The scapegoat mechanism redirects social tensions onto an outsider whose sacrifice hides and releases the tensions produced by mimetic desire. That's the nightmare underneath the cathedral floor. The crowd doesn't merely kill the victim because the victim is hated. Sometimes the victim is killed because the crowd cannot metabolize its own chaos. And then afterwards, the victim becomes holy enough to conceal the fact that the crowd never changed. This is why dead prophets are so useful to sick societies. A dead prophet cannot audit the budget. A dead prophet can't ask why the founder never trained successors. A dead prophet can't call out the security chief who has started enjoying his proximity to the guns. And a dead prophet cannot stand up in the meeting and say, "You keep praising my courage because you're afraid of discovering your own." That's the deepest meaning of a society creates martyrs when it admires courage more than it distributes courage. If the good remains concentrated in one luminous body, one throat, one voice, the old world knows exactly what to do. It isolates the body. It waits for the friend to become jealous, the bureaucracy to become offended, the empire to become nervous, the mob getting hungry, the disciples becoming way too confused. Then it cuts the throat and it waits for the songs to feed on afterward. Thomas Sankara is one of the cleanest modern wounds in this pattern. He was not a vague revolutionary aesthetic. He was a soldier president of Burkina Faso who tried to make sovereignty concrete in Africa. Britannica describes his program as aimed at eradicating corruption, fighting environmental degradation, empowering women, ending genital mutilation on women, expanding education and healthcare, and liquidating imperial domination. His government's mass vaccination campaign reportedly reached 77% of children under 6 against measles, meningitis, and yellow fever within weeks. And according to research on the National Vaccination Commando program, he spoke openly about debt as an instrument of domination and warned other African leaders that if Burkina Faso stood alone in refusing debt, he would not be at the next conference. A few months later, he was dead, killed by his friend. In 2022, his friend that killed him and ruled for 27 years, Blaise Compaoré, his former friend and successor, who ruled Burkina Faso for 27 years after that coup. 27 years. All that work undone. He was finally sentenced in absentia to life imprisonment for the complicity in Sankara's murder. The easy thing is to turn Sankara into a poster, right? The harder thing, though, is to look at him as a design problem without reducing his humanity to a case study. He had CK, the communion kernel, the real fruit of life-serving power. He saw that sovereignty is not just a flag or a speech. Sovereignty is whether children are vaccinated, whether women are full human beings that don't get mutilated, that they have a say in the public destiny of people, whether food and production are local enough that a nation is not being led around by the stomach, whether the officials live like servants or like little imported kings, whether the land itself can keep breathing under the feet of the future. Sankara saw a lot, but he was still one throat. His project threatened corruption, dependencies, status hierarchies, foreign interests, domestic elites, and old structures in a country whose institutions were not yet strong enough to make his vision assassination proof. And this isn't like a cheap criticism of Sankara here. It's not me sitting safely in a 2026 with Wi-Fi and saying, "Ah, yes, Brother Thomas, have you considered a better spreadsheet?" It's a grief I have turned into architecture to find a solution. The lesson is not that he should have dreamed smaller, God forbid. The lesson is that any dream large enough to threaten vampires has to become distributed as fast as possible. A vision that can be murdered by murdering one man has not yet become a civilization. It may be true, it may be beautiful, it may even be righteous, but it is still tactically mortal. This is where James Madison, of all people, walks into the Mesa like a dry constitutional wizard and reminds the poets that virtue is not enough. In Federalist number 51, Madison says the great security against the concentration of power is to give officials the constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments by other officials. His famous phrase is that ambition must counteract ambition. The point is not cynicism for its own sake. The point is adult design here. Stop building systems that only work if everyone remains pure, loyal, humble, and sane. Men are not angels. Organizations are not immune to appetite. Inner circles are not sacraments. And revolutionary language does not sterilize the human ego. The Mesa translation is simple but not simplistic. Love power enough to train it, distrust power enough to audit it, and respect power enough not to leave it in the hands of one beloved person with good intentions and no succession plan. This is the doctrine of the wolf entering politics. The wolf is not evil. The wolf is hunger, force, ambition, sex, aggression, territorial instinct, strategic intelligence, courage, and the will to bite when biting is necessary. A society that kills the wolf becomes prey. A society that crowns the wolf becomes vampire. A society that trains the wolf gets guardians. But guardians without audit become priests. And priests without correction become gods. And gods in politics eventually need bodies for the sacrifice. Karl Popper gives us the next piece of the exit. Popper's political philosophy is useful here because he reframes democracy away from the childish question of who should rule and toward the more serious question, how do we remove bad rulers without bloodshed? How do you do that? The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy surmises his view that democracies, better than other systems, permit changes of government without bloodshed and rely on institutions shaped by public criticism, discussion, and the willingness to listen. This is anti-crucifixion technology. A society that cannot correct itself without killing someone will keep needing victims. If every serious correction requires a coup, a purge, an assassination, a civil war, excommunication, a cancellation ritual, or public humiliation sacrifice, then Girard's machine is still humming under the floor. The chorus Commonwealth has to normalize correction before panic turns correction into violence. There has to be a bell before the gun. a way to say, hey, this is drifting. This is drifting off course before the dissident becomes a corpse. A way to remove a leader before the general decides he is history's emergency brake. This is why criticism cannot be treated as treason inside of any movement that claims to serve life. Criticism is not always wise. Sometimes it's petty as fuck. It's bitter, uninformed, theatrical, or obviously coming from a man who needs sleep and magnesium. Fine. But if the movement has no way to metabolize criticism, it will eventually metabolize critics. Robert Michaels explains why this is not optional. His iron law of oligarchy argues that even organizations committed to democracy tend to drift toward rule by an elite few because organization itself produces leadership, specialization, bureaucracy, and dependency on that system. Britannica's summary is almost comically brutal. Democratic organizations tend to succumb to oligarchy, authoritarianism, and bureaucracy. That means that every movement grows a little throne somewhere. It may not look like a throne. It may look like the person who controls the calendar, the donor list, the passwords, the microphone, the relationship with the venue, the security plan, the sacred vocabulary, or the social punishment machine. It may be the founder everyone loves too much to correct. It might be the traumatized person nobody is allowed to challenge. It may be the process expert who makes simple things impossible until everyone is dependent on their priestly interpretation of the bylaws. It might even be the tough guy with the guns. It may be the kind woman who is quietly doing all the unpaid labor until her nervous system gives out and the whole thing collapses because nobody learned how to replace her without consuming her. This is where so many good projects go to die. Not in the manifesto, not in the first speech. They die in the pantry, in the group chat, in the budget, in the calendar, in the unspoken resentments, in the one person who knows how the printer works, the founder who calls it dedication when really he has built a hostage situation around his own indispensability. The chorus Commonwealth has to make replaceability honorable. That sounds cold until you understand it properly. It doesn't mean people are disposable at all. It means the work loves them enough not to eat them. Fanon brings the anti-colonial knife to the table. In The Pitfalls of a National Consciousness, he warns that liberation can be captured by a national bourgeoisie that inherits the shell of power without truly transforming the people's condition at all. He writes about a class whose psychology is that of a businessman rather than a builder. And he warns that the greed of settlers can be matched by the local elites once the flag changes. That insight is essential because sovereignty is one of those words that can either feed a people or turn into stage fog for men in uniforms. Real sovereignty is not just saying, "We are free," loudly enough. It's the lived capacity to feed, heal, educate, build, defend, repair, reproduce, deliberate, remember, and correct without being owned by whoever controls debt, weapons, software, the energy, food, media, or our myths. A country can shout independence while still being led around by imported status, elite extraction, foreign dependency on oil, and local vampires who have learned the songs of liberation. Fanon helps us see why replacing the colonizer with a native predator is not victory. It is just the vampire changing languages. Eleanor Ostrom gives us the hands. Her work on the commons breaks the lazy binary that says either the state must control everything or private owners must carve it all up. Communities can govern shared resources, but not through vibes or sentimental trust. Durable commons require clear boundaries, locally fitted rules, participatory rulemaking, monitoring, graduated sanctions, accessible conflict resolution, and recognition of self-governance, all nested structures for larger systems. This isn't romantic, and thank God for that. The chorus Commonwealth cannot be built out of incense and trauma dumps, and everybody just holding space until the pantry's empty and the wolf is running concessions. A commons needs rules people understand. It needs correction that is not cruelty and mercy that is not a doormat. It needs monitoring that does not become paranoia. It needs sanctions that do not turn every mistake into exile. It needs local knowledge because one central brain cannot feed every root. Ostrom is what happens when the beautiful moral instinct gets a tool belt. Now we enter Carl Jung. Jung brings us back to Peter's body walking on the water. Individuation. In Jungian psychology, individuation is the process of self-realization, of becoming who one really is through the interplay of conscious and unconscious and the synthesis of opposites, the anima and animus. The Society of Analytical Psychology describes it as the discovery and experience of meaning and purpose, a process of finding oneself and becoming what one is. This is why Peter sinks. Jung has the answer to this. He is not only afraid of water, he's afraid of becoming real. Peter's afraid of becoming real as Jesus Christ is. Inside the boat, Peter has a role. He's a disciple, a believer, a witness. He's a supporter. He's just one of the boys in the boat. Out there on the water, though, he is no longer protected by group identity. He is singular, visible, responsible. The storm is not just weather, it's the whole pressure of self-individuation. To become capable is to lose your innocence of incapacity. It's to realize that your power level is over 9,000. And once you know you can step out on that water, you can no longer honestly live as if you were only a passenger. You are now a player in the game of life. And that is terrifying. So people project greatness outward. He's divine. She's gifted. They are heroes. I'm just a regular person. Sometimes that is honest humility. Often, though, it is the psyche hiding behind a velvet curtain. The thing we worship from a distance may be a disowned capacity inside ourselves. Not equal in degree, not identical in calling, but real enough to demand training. The chorus Commonwealth is individuation made social. It is the community refusing to let projection replace apprenticeship. This is also why Leto II, the God Emperor of Dune, haunts the whole question. Leto II is the nightmare answer to a species that will not learn voluntarily. He sees humanity trapped by prescience, spice dependency, empire, religious momentum, and the recurring addiction to saviors. It's very similar to what is going on right now in the current war we're embroiled in that may very well trigger World War III. Leto II's golden path is not a gentle formation. It's a forced anti-dependency on leaders. He becomes the tyrant so completely that humanity eventually explodes outward in the scattering, too dispersed to be captured again by one president or one prescient ruler or centralized catastrophe. Summaries of the Dune arc describe the Golden Path as Leto's effort to force humanity beyond sheltered safety and single point control. He burned the boat. You better start learning how to walk on water. The lesson is not that Leto II was good because his tyranny worked. That's vampire logic with a library card. The lesson is that if formation is delayed long enough, tyranny starts to look like the only remaining instrument strong enough to break the pattern is total coercion and tyranny. Leto is what happens when the boat never becomes a school and history decides to send a monster with a curriculum. The Mesa answer has to be earlier, freer, and more humane. A voluntary irreversibility instead of forced irreversibility. Vows, not chains. Training, not trauma. A school before the emperor. Cortez gives the same warning in historical flesh. The popular story says Hernan Cortez burned his ships in 1519 so his men could not turn back once they saw these horrific Aztec blood sacrifices, people carving dudes' hearts out and pyramids and streets running with blood, right? All his men wanted to run away. Cortez was like, no, we're staying and we're fighting. Britannica's summary preserves that version and frames it as committing himself to conquest. Cortez did not simply liberate everyone from the Aztec Empire. Even though many indigenous groups had real reasons to ally against the Mexican domination, he overthrew the Aztec Empire and won Mexico for the crown of Spain. The conquest involved Spanish forces, indigenous allies, superior weaponry, political crises, and disease, including devastating smallpox. So, burn the boats has to be handled like nitroglycerin. If I burn my own boat because I have freely chosen a vow, that can be courage. If I burn your boat so you have no retreat, that's coercion wearing a heroic cape. The Mesa law is this: only burn the boats you own. A course Commonwealth cannot be founded by destroying other people's exits and calling it destiny. That may produce motion. It may even defeat a worse order. But it carries conquest in its bones unless it is bounded by consent, shared governance, exit rights, reciprocal obligation, and real dignity for people supposedly being liberated. Now the good news, because there's been a lot of bad. And there is good news. Despite the fact that this whole subject sometimes makes you want to just grab humanity by the lapels and shake it until coins, excuses, and old gods all fall out, is the fragments of the Peter Protocol have existed before. Ella Baker is one of the purest American examples. She did not want movements addicted to charismatic leadership. She was part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So we'll call it the SNCC for short. The SNCC's own history records her saying that strong people do not need strong leaders, while emphasizing that making this true required extensive travel, conversation, and meetings. That last part's very important. Strong people don't need strong leaders was not just a bumper sticker. It was labor. It meant patient multiplication, not vague empowerment noises. Baker was doing exactly what the chorus Commonwealth requires, converting admiration into capacity, increasing the number of throats singing. The Highlander Folk School did something similar in institutional form. The King Institute describes Highlander as a training ground for Southern civil rights activists, one of the few integrated meeting places in the South, and notes that Rosa Parks attended a 1955 workshop there for 4 months before refusing to give up her bus seat in Montgomery. The point is not to reduce Parks' courage to workshop certificates. The point is that courage ripens in containers. People love the lightning strike because it makes history feel clean. But before lightning, there is weather. Highlander was weather making. Mondragon gives another fragment, this time in economics. Father Jose Maria Arez Minadaritia, forgive me for butchering that, did not merely preach dignity to workers and then hope the market developed a conscience. The Mondragon story begins with education, technical formation, cooperative enterprises, and institutions that allowed shared ownership to become materially real. Sources on Mondragon preserve the idea that socializing knowledge democratizes power. Its own history traces the founding of the first cooperative company, Olgor, in 1956 from the identity of its worker founders and the educational work that preceded it. That phrase, socializing knowledge democratizes power, it is one of the great practical keys. If one person knows how to fix the machine, one person has power. If one person understands the budget, one person has power. If one person can speak in public, negotiate with landlords, write grants, build websites, run security, teach children, interpret law, repair engines, grow food, de-escalate conflict, or hold a room under pressure, then the future has one throat in that domain that can easily be slit. Socialized knowledge is not trivia. It is anti-assassination architecture. The Zapatistas, how do you say that? Some of these are not of my native language. Zapatistas offer another fragment in their rotating governance structures. Open Democracy describes the Zapatista Juntas de Buen Gobernero, or Good Government Councils, as elected through assemblies and serving on a rotating basis, sometimes in shifts as short as a few weeks. Partly to prevent clientelistic networks from forming. Whatever one thinks of every ideological detail, the rotation principle matters. It recognizes that power congeals if it sits too long in one chair. Now, none of these examples are perfect, and thank God, because perfect examples are usually propaganda or dead. The point is not to find a spotless model and kneel before it and just do only that. The point is to find fragments of the living pattern. Baker's multiplication of leadership, Highlander's training ecology, Mondragon's knowledge to power pipeline, Zapatista's rotation, Ostrom's commons rules, Popper's correction without bloodshed, Madison's counterweights, Fannon's warning against local vampires, Carl Jung's withdrawal of projection, Girard's exposure of sacrifice, and Sankara's blazing proof that sovereignty must become more than one man's courage. and sung by everybody. The chorus Commonwealth is the synthesis of those fragments under the mesa of life. It says that non-sacrificial civilization has to replace victim unity with shared burden. The old world achieves unity by finding a body to carry the unbearable tension. The Mesa answer is to not deny tension. That would be childish. The Mesa answer is to distribute it into practice, law, ritual, apprenticeship, humor, work, music, production, correction, worship that leads to imitation, and power that remains answerable to the life it claims to defend. This is where everyone carries a little cross so that no one has to become the corpse that holds the whole world together. It's achievable. It can be more than just a pretty little line. It means that society must normalize small, regular, chosen sacrifices before it demands grand, involuntary ones. Time, attention, money, ego, comfort, laziness. The need to be seen as perfect. The desire to be rescued. The addiction to commentary without contribution. The fantasy that someone else will build the bridge while you post about bridges being important. These are the small crosses that prevent the large crucifixions. If nobody will carry the little burden, history starts shopping for a martyr. So how do we actually start this? Not with a nation, not with a grand institution, or by waiting until some billionaire with a taste for myth funds the mace of life like a Marvel cinematic universe for the soul. We start where all real formation starts, in small rooms with real people doing repeatable things. A chorus cell is not a discussion group in disguise. Discussion's fine, but endless discourse can become a jacuzzi for the anxious intelligent. A chorus cell has to produce formation. 5 to 12 people is enough. Weekly meetings is enough. The exact names of the roles can evolve, but the function matters. Someone holds the human warmth of the room. Someone else watches for scapegoating and Newman locks. Someone turns the inside into artifacts that's portable and teachable. Someone audits the power. Someone teaches a practical skill you can actually use. Everyone leaves with one bounded act before the next gathering. The point is not to drown people in assignments. The point is to make stepping normal, teaching people how to walk on water, how to do the seemingly impossible step by step. You do not fix a life in one heroic spasm. You take one clean step, return, report, get caught if you sank, and raised back up to the boat, and then learn how to catch somebody else. That is how the boat becomes a school. It has to feel human enough that beginners are not humiliated, serious enough that spectatorship cannot hide forever, and joyful enough that the work does not become a fluorescent light cult of responsibility where everyone talks like a nonprofit grant proposal had a baby with a hostage note. There has to be food. There has to be laughter. There has to be beauty. There has to be music, or at least the spiritual equivalent of music. People do not join durable worlds because the bylaws are technically correct. They join because something in their ribs recognizes home, danger, dignity, and invitation at the same time, reaching for fortune and glory. The song matters. The vampire knows this, which is why they build rituals so well. Flags, chants, uniforms, enemies, slogans, spectacles, belonging, and myth. They understand that humans are not moved by policy alone. The good too often hands people a PDF and a moral obligation, then wonders why the vampire with drums got the crowd. The chorus Commonwealth needs doctrine, yes, but also pot roast. It needs the bell and the budget. It needs rites of passage and shared calendars. It needs a room where someone can learn to speak without being devoured. Learn to lead without being worshipped. Learn to be corrected without being exiled. And learn to hold power without becoming aroused by domination. That last part is not optional. The doctrine of the wolf must sit close to the center, because any movement that cannot distinguish strength from predation will either castrate itself or crown monsters. Mercy is beautiful, but mercy without boundaries becomes a buffet for predators. Strength is beautiful, but strength without the communion kernel becomes a private security firm for appetite. The guardian path is harder. Train danger to serve life. Do not shame masculine force out of the room and then act surprised when only covert manipulators and narcissists remain. Do not glorify force until every insecure man thinks a tactical vest is a soul. Make strength answerable. Make protection honorable. Make access conditional. Make repair real. And make audit sacred. And yes, the guardians must be audited too, especially them. The person holding the muzzle can become addicted to the feeling of holding it. The anti-vampire committee can start tasting blood. The one who protects the garden can begin to confuse the garden with his territory and not the community's. That is why no guardian without audit is not a decorative phrase. It's survival. It's Madison, Michaels, and the Wolf Doctrine all shaking hands over the same dangerous truth. Good power must never be trusted merely because it calls itself good. It must be tested. The same applies to founders. If the founder is not trying to become replaceable, the founder is already drifting. This does not mean the founder has no unique role. Some people really do carry ignition. Some people are bell strikers, pattern namers, threshold crossers. Pretending otherwise is fake egalitarianism. And fake egalitarianism often becomes just another resentment factory. But ignition is not ownership. The mature founder does not ask, how do I make everyone need me? The mature founder asks, what must be taught, documented, distributed, and embodied so the work survives my absence or assassination? If the answer is nothing survives without me, that is not evidence of greatness at all. That is the founder's unbaptized ego wearing the movement as a cloak. The chorus Commonwealth must therefore treat succession as a spiritual practice, not paperwork afterthought, a spiritual practice. Can you bless the one who will carry the work differently from you? Can you train someone who may surpass you without quietly sabotaging them? Can you watch your language become shared property without acting like every adaptation is theft? Can you build something that does not collapse when your nervous system does? Can you let the chorus sing without needing every note to prove it came from your throat? This is where the unsung come in. The unsung are not useless by any means. They are uninitiated. They are often carrying notes they have never been asked to sing in a room that would catch them if their voice cracked. Some are mechanics, nurses, mothers, comedians, accountants, carpenters, veterans, teachers, coders, cooks, recovered addicts, tired fathers, weird mystics, autistic pattern seers, musicians, gardeners, local historians, people with trucks, people with tools, people with jokes sharp enough to pop mass delusion like a balloon at a funeral. The old world turns them into consumers, voters, audience members, employees, patients, demographics, followers, and occasional outrage batteries to hook up into the matrix. The chorus Commonwealth has to look at them and say, no, there is a note in you that the future may actually need. But invitation cannot be mushy. It has to be concrete. A person should be able to enter the chorus Commonwealth without being asked to swallow an entire metaphysical operating system in one gulp. Let them come because they want to help with an event. Let them come because they can teach first aid or how to swing a hammer. Let them come because the music is good. Because the conversation is less stupid than the internet. Let them come because somebody needs help moving tables. Then, once inside the warmth field, let them discover that responsibility is not a sermon shouted from a mountaintop. It is a practice with handles made for the human hand. That is how you incentivize the mantle without vampire coercion. You give belonging without demanding submission. You give status for service instead of domination. You give real roles, not flattery. You make contribution visible to everybody. You protect beginners from humiliation and protect the group from predators. You reward people for training successors, not hoarding their expertise. And you make courage socially contagious by making the first step survivable and the 100th step honorable. The vampires overpower good people by monopolizing the machinery of desire. They make evil feel exciting, belonging feel tribal, courage feel violent, transgression feel sexy, domination feeling like destiny, and obedience feels like safety. The good cannot answer that with beige virtue and a committee agenda that smells like stale coffee. It has to become beautiful enough to desire, strong enough to trust, practical enough to feed people, and honest enough to correct itself when the rot starts growing in its own walls. That is why the Mesa cannot merely be a philosophy. It has to become a culture of formation, a school, a venue, a practice, a show, a household pattern with a family, a way of arguing, a way of laughing and building and handling conflict, a way of training wolves without worshiping them, a way of taking the divine projection off the lone figure on the water and asking with terrifying tenderness, what step is now yours? There will still be martyrs. I do not want to lie. Some vampires will not be reasoned with. Some empires do not politely give up the feeding tube because your governance model has nested circles and a nice logo. Some good people will still die. Some founders will still be betrayed. Some Peters will still sink in the water, and some boats will still rot into spectator boxes. The Chorus Commonwealth is not a magic spell that abolishes tragedy of life. It is a serious attempt to stop cooperating with tragedy's laziest mechanisms. It says if someone luminous appears, do not merely admire them. Study the method before the murder. If a movement begins, build the school before the shrine. If power gathers, audit it before it crowns itself. If people are afraid, give them a practice before fear demands a victim. If a leader rises, train successors while the leader is still breathing. If a commons forms, give it rules with mercy and teeth. And when the wolf enters, do not pretend it's a golden retriever. And do not shoot it for having fangs. Train it to guard the garden. And keep someone watching the trainer. This is how we build a future with too many roots to be murdered, too many throats to be slit that are still singing. Not by pretending the knife will never come, but by making sure the knife cannot find the only throat singing the future. And not by despising Peter for not trying to walk on water again, but by refusing to let the boat waste what Peter proved. Not by becoming Leto II or by doing formation before history reaches for tyranny. We have to do that. We have to form ourselves before history reaches for tyranny again. That is what it is. That is the pattern we're stuck in. And there's a way out. There is an exit. And again, it's not by worshiping great people like Sankara while leaving every future Sankara exposed, but by building the institutions, the schools, the local competencies, coalitions, doing audits, and crafting rituals that make assassination less useful to the vampires. Not by romanticizing Cortez's burning of the boats, but by choosing vows freely and never destroying another person's exit in the name of your destiny or mankind's. The old sacrificial world says the tension must go somewhere, and eventually it chooses a body. The Chorus Commonwealth says the tension must be distributed into a shared work before it becomes blood hungry. It says the crowd must stop outsourcing its courage to become the one beautiful fool willing to step into the storm. It says worship that does not become imitation is too easily digested by the vampire world as food. It says sovereignty begins when ordinary people become harder to herd, harder to starve, harder to deceive, harder to isolate, infantilize, or convince that their only role in history is applause. I can feel the shape of it now. Not a nation state exactly, not a religion exactly, not a political party or a self-help brand, not a militia or a monastery, but something older and newer at once. A formation culture for free human beings under pressure. A way to keep the good from dying alone. A way to help the unsung find pitch. A way to make the mesa of life walkable and show you where the cliffs are before you fall off. The Chorus Commonwealth begins wherever the boat becomes a school. When the witness says, "Show me the step." When the founder says, "The work must survive me." When the guardian says, "Who audits my hand on the muzzle?" When the critic is heard before he becomes a dissident. It begins when knowledge is taught before it becomes a throne. When courage is practiced before the tyrant uses fear as curriculum. When the dead prophet is no longer used as incense over unchanged lives. It begins, maybe most of all, when the unsung person in the back of the room realizes the song was never meant to be performed at them. The future does not need every person to become a Messiah. That is not the point. The point is far more dangerous. The future needs enough people to stop using the Messiah as an excuse to remain unborn. It needs enough roots under the stone that the vampire cannot kill the orchard by finding one trunk. It needs enough trained voices that the assassin cannot silence the song by cutting one throat. It needs enough disciplined wolves guarding the garden that predators are no longer getting to define strength. That is the work. That is the cornerstone. The miracle was never that only one man learned to walk on water. The miracle was that another man stepped. Phanesthai.